We're on DAF Pei Aleph Amid Aleph at the Mishnah. Kasav Lagarish Esishto V'Nimlach. Person hires a sofer, writes a get, and then changes his mind and never gives it to her. Bei Shammai Omrim Paslam in HaKahuna, Ubei Silal Omrim Afal Pisha Nasno Lal Tanai Velo Naaseh HaTanai Lo Paslam in HaKahuna. So you have a very stark machlokes between Bei Shammai and Bei Silal. Bei Shammai say that even if you never presented her the get, the very fact that you've written her name in the get makes her, certainly midrabanan, puzzle to ever marry a Kohen. Wow, look how machmir they are, that any woman, Beis Shammai say, who's even connected to divorce can never marry a Kohen. We certainly don't paskin that way. There have been many cases, halacha lemaisa, which are more in line with Beis Hillel. What do Beis Hillel say? Even if you give her the get, but it was a get al tanai, it was a conditional get, and the condition was never fulfilled. Let's say he said to her, you're only divorced with this get if you give me 200 zuz. And she never comes up with the 200 zuz, and then he dies. So Beis Hillel say she was never divorced. Even though she was given a bill of divorce, she was never halachically divorced, and therefore she can marry a Kohen. The Gemara now says, Shalach le Rav Yosef bereder Rav Menachem Dvil l'Shmuel, that this rabbi who came from the town of Dvil asked Shmuel a shaila. Yilamdenu Rabbeinu, Yatzal of Kol Ish Ploni Kohen Kosav Get Leishto V'Yosheves Tachtav V'Mshamshas Omahu. There's a rumor in our town, and the rumor is that Ploni, a Kohen, divorced his wife, and now she came back to the house and she's living with him, and they're living as husband and wife. The question is, what should we do in such a situation? How do we deal with this on a communal level? So Sholach lo teitzei v'hadover tzarich bedika. So he sent him back the following psak. He says, at least temporarily she has to leave the house, and then we have to examine what's going on. We have to figure out what's going on. We have to examine. So mahi. So what is the examination? Ilema di imevatlinan kala olo mevatlinan. So the Gemara says, maybe you'll tell me that Shmuel's question is, are we able to quell the rumor or not? Maybe that's the issue. Let's see if we can silence the rumor. And if we can silence the rumor, we'll let her go back to her husband. And if we can't silence the rumor, so then she has to leave him. But wait a minute. But the Gemara says, and this is very interesting, it really needs a lot of more analysis. There were two different attitudes towards communal rumors. In Surah, where Rav lived, they tried to quell communal rumors. They made an effort. If there was a rumor that something inappropriate had been done al pi halacha, they would try to quell the rumor. In Shmuel's locale, they didn't try to quell the rumor, because Shmuel's attitude was, if there is a rumor, this is an indication that there's a very good chance that something inappropriate has been done. Why should we quell the rumor? Let us investigate it. We're not going to try and hush it. We're going to try and bring it out and make sure that if there was something done by people in our community, we have to make sure that we identify it. In other words, let's not reward bad behavior by trying to silence the rumor. Let's try to bring it to light. So therefore, why would Shmuel say, if Shmuel comes from Naharda, where that's the prevailing attitude, why would Shmuel over here say, let's see if we can silence the rumor? That can't be the issue. So Ela di ikaru l'nesina ksiva. But rather, Shmuel said, we have to investigate the way people speak in that town of Deville. If people sometimes say giving, and instead of saying that he gave his wife a get, they say he wrote his wife a get, and the rumor is that the guy wrote his wife a get, well, if the rumor was that he wrote his wife a get, if people use that terminology as shorthand for he wrote it and he gave it, so then we would have to force the wife to leave him permanently. But if, when people say he wrote his wife a get, they strictly mean he wrote her a get, so then there's nothing to talk about and she can live with him, because just writing your wife a get and not giving it to her is perfectly okay. So the Gemara asks, so the Gemara says, I don't understand. Let's say you're right, that in Dvil they use shorthand, and sometimes when they say he wrote his wife a get, it means that he both wrote it and he gave her. But also the words he wrote his wife a get certainly don't not mean that he just wrote her a get. In other words, certainly sometimes it means that he gave her a get, and sometimes it means he wrote her a get. So why not just assume that it means he wrote her a get? Why would you force her to leave? So the Gemara says, in di imiglaya milsa de karul nesina ksiva dilma nasan ka amri. So the answer is, and this is the way Rashi understands the whole Shakla V'Tarya, is that was precisely what Shmuel was concerned about, is that even if on occasion they would say that the words he wrote his wife a get, and they would mean he wrote and gave his wife a get, then we have to be choshesh that he actually divorced her. We don't know for certain if he divorced her or not, but if that's the rumor, and that's the way people speak, it could mean that he actually divorced her, and from that suffix, Shmuel says we would have to be machmir and force them to separate. So now, unless we were able to certainly prove that that was not the case. So now the Gemara says Teitzei, but why should she have to leave her husband? V'ha'amar Ravashi kol kala de basar nisun lo chayshinan lei. But one second, Ravashi said, and we paskin this way, that anytime there's a rumor that occurs after the fact, after two people are already married, so then you don't reckon with that rumor. You only reckon with the rumor before the fact, not after the fact. So the Gemara says, "My teitzei nami, teitzei misheni." So the Gemara's answer is, no, you're right. If the rumor was that her first husband, the Kohen, divorced her, and then he let her back into the house, and they're remarried, that rumor is not going to be reckoned with. The issue that Shmuel was concerned about is that if the first husband, Kohen, dies, and then she claims, I was never divorced, and she wants to marry a second man who's a Kohen, that we're not going to allow her to do. That's what Shmuel says we need to examine, because if the rumor is that he wrote her a get, and they really mean that he gave her a get, then it's not going to be an issue for when she's still married to her first Kohen husband, but if she wants to marry a second Kohen husband, we're not going to permit her based on that rumor. So im keinat tamotzi laz al banav shel rishon. But the Gemara says, well, if you're going to give credence to the rumor for the second husband and disallow her from marrying the second husband, aren't you then de facto casting aspersions on the children that she had from the first marriage after the rumor started? Because essentially what you're saying is, no, you can't marry the second Kohen because maybe your first husband divorced you 10 years ago. Well, then what about the children now that she had since that time? That rumor, then, if you're entertaining that, is casting aspersions and suggesting that the children that she had with him are chalolim with the first husband. So the Gemara answers, Kevin de misheni hu de mafkinan la umeirishon lo mafkinan la asi lameimar samach lamisa gerisha. So the Gemara says no. It's not going to cast aspersions on the children that she had with her first husband because we never required her to leave her first husband. And the very fact that we never required her to leave her first husband, and we're only requiring her not to marry the second Kohen, is if people are going to question it, then people will assume, okay, so he must have divorced her after all the kids were born at the end, towards the end of their marriage, right before he died. Yeah.
Does the Gemara deal with the sofer, the Adim, the Bezdin? There's a to check with.
So that is what we're going to deal with. I mean, this is all before we're able to ascertain the facts. And remember, communication is very poor between Deville and Naharda. I mean, this is, Shmuel says, that's why it's tzarech bedika. We got to look into this. We have to find out how people are speaking. Number one, is the rumor, is there teeth to the rumor? Because if the rumor is just that he wrote it and that's all people meant, then that means nothing. But if it means that he wrote it and he gave it, so then we got to say, okay, maybe there's something to the rumor. If you can prove that the rumor is false, gesundheit hate. Do the proper investigation. But this is before we know the facts. Yeah.
Let me just clarify. The Gemara is saying that the halacha is that b'diavad, if a Kohen actually divorces his wife and then lives with her again,
and he has children with her.
Yes, the children.
So the children are chalolim. The children are invalid kohanim. They're not kohanim.
And we wouldn't have would we in the chafil let him marry his wife again?
A Kohen is never. Once a Kohen marries, divorces his wife, he can never remarry her. Yeah. We're going to learn more about that shortly.
Rabbi said Shmuel would investigate the Adim, the sofer, but it says that even if there's a rumor, what's the purpose of investigating an Ardea where they don't call rumors?
Yeah, but that's only if you can't verify the facts. That's if you can't verify the facts. If you know the facts because you've figured out from Adam exactly what happened, you're not going to listen to a rumor. The rumor is meaningless in that case. Amar Rabbi bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yechanan Mishum Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, Bo'u Rei Shelo Kedoros Arishonim Doros Achronim. Come and see how people are more liberal in later generations than in earlier generations. Doros Arishonim Beishamai Doros Achronim Rabbi Dosa. The early generations, people were machmir like Beis Shammai, that even if a man just wrote his wife a get, then that stigmatized her from the kahuna, even if he never gave it to her. But look at later generations. There's Reb Dosa, the Tanya Shavuyo Cheles Betruma Diver Reb Dosa. The Reb Dosa had paskined that even if a girl who's a Bas Kohen was taken as a captive by non-Jews, she's still allowed to go back to her father's house, eat truma, under the assumption that she was never violated by her captors. And Amar Reb Dosa v'chima asala aravizeh mipnei shemiach lo bein dadeha pasla min hakahuna. He says, because after all, says Reb Dosa, what did this promiscuous Arab do? And Tosfos points out that the chiddush is even if he's an Arab captor, because the Gemara says that Arabs are the most promiscuous nation or promiscuous people in the world. Just look at all the online videos of Arabs and their goats, right? They're the most promiscuous people in the world, right? And yet, says the Gemara, you still can assume that she wasn't violated because that was not what captors did back then. They captured them for ransom. So he may have just played around with her body, but never violated her, never deflowered her. And so you see, basically, what the Gemara is saying is that later generations are more liberal in their psak halacha. Now, is this a criticism? Perhaps it is. It sounds contextually like it is a criticism. But again, this requires analysis, because not all the time do we say that being makel on a person's personal status is wrong. Sometimes you have to be makel, sometimes it's proper. Anyway. Amar Rabbi bar Barchana, Amar Rabbi Yechanan Mishum Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai, Boer e shelo kedoros harishonim doros ha'achronim. Doros harishonim machnisin peroseim derech terak simon kedei lechayven b'maiser. Doros ha'achronim machnisin peroseim derech gagos v'derech karfifos kedei lepochen min ha'maiser. Also look at the way that people are more liberal in later generations, and this clearly is critical. Earlier generations would want to give the proper tithes, so they would dafka bring their produce in through the proper doorway, the front doorway of the barn, in order to make it chayiv in trumas and maestros. But later generations sought ways to exempt themselves from tithing by bringing the produce in from the field into back doors, through windows, and other ways to exempt them from meiser. The Amar Rabbi Yanai ena tevel mischayv b'meiser ad sheyira pinei habayis. As Rabbi Yanai said, that the only time produce becomes subject to tithes is if it enters into the house in the normative fashion. Shenemar bi'arti hakodesh min habayis. As the pasuk says, that a person's confessional is, I've properly tithed everything when it came into the house. So therefore, you see, it has to enter into the house normatively in order for it to be chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees only in one respect. He says it's true, if you bring it in abnormally, it'll be putter, but it doesn't just have to be brought into the house normatively in order to be liable for meiser. Even if it's brought from the field into the courtyard, and you bring it in into the normal front entrance of the courtyard, that in itself makes it chayiv and trumas and meiser. So it doesn't have to just come into the barn, to the covered area of the threshing barn. Even if it just comes into the courtyard in front of the threshing barn normatively, it's going to be chayiv and trumas and maestros. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. That if a man divorces his wife and then later secludes himself in the same hotel with her, so Beis Shammai omrim eina tzricha hemenu get sheni, uBeis Hillel omrim tzricha hemenu get sheni. Here another very fundamental machlokes, which we've seen before. Beis Shammai say she doesn't need a second get. No, they didn't. Just because they've checked into the same hotel doesn't mean that he remarried her in the hotel. She doesn't need a second get. And Beis Hillel say no. There's an assumption that there's been a new marriage, they've reignited their relationship, and therefore she needs a second get. This has very practical applications. When a woman gets divorced from her husband, we tell the couple, you may never have yichud, you may never seclude yourself together with each other ever again, because that could invalidate the entire get. Recently was a case like that in our community. So Amosai bizman shenizgarsha min hanisuin. But says Beis Hillel, the only time she needs a second get is if the divorce was from nisuin. They had been married for 10 years, and they had been intimate with each other. So therefore there's a familiarity which gives us grounds to assume that if they were in the same hotel together, they were intimate and remarried. However, umodim beniskarsha min ha'erisin she'en atzricha hemenu get she'en mipnei she'en libo gasba. But if they were never fully married, they were only betrothed, and then the husband divorces her, and then they check into a hotel together, even Beis Hillel agree that you don't have to assume that they were intimate and they, and that they got remarried, because there's no physical familiarity between the two of them, so there's no reason to assume that they got remarried.
When you say check into a hotel, do you mean into the same room or a small?
It's unclear from the language of the Gemara. It just says pundaki. It says an inn. They go into an inn together. So the Gemara is going to have to clarify for us what exactly happened and what didn't happen. So the Gemara now says, Amar Rabba bar Barchana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Machlokes b'shara'ua shenivala. The Beis Shammai Sabri Adam Osa Be'ilaso Be'ilasnos, Ubeis Hillel Sabri En Adam Osa Be'ilaso Be'ilasnos. Avalora Uashenivala, Divrei Hakol Eina Tzricha Hemenu Get Sheni. So Rabbi Yochanan tells us a big chiddush. He says the only time that there's a machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is if there were actual witnesses to the act of intimacy itself. In other words, witnesses peeked through the window and they saw them in bed together. That's when we say that Beis Shammai hold that she doesn't need a second get, and Beis Hillel hold that she does need a second get. Beis Shammai say that even though we know that they were physically intimate, but a husband did it for a fling. He didn't do it for the purposes of rematrimony. But Beis Hillel say no. No man, no pious Jewish man is going to engage in physical intimacy with his ex-wife unless it's for the purposes of remarriage. And so therefore we assume that he remarried her with that intimacy, and therefore she needs a second get. So Tanan. So, but essentially what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that if all we saw them is to check into a hotel room together, we know that they had yichud. That's all we know. We know that they were secluded together. But do we know that they were physically intimate? No, we don't know that. And therefore we don't have to assume any intimacy at all, and therefore even Beis Hillel would agree that she doesn't need a get. So now the Gemara says, well, wait a minute, let's look at our Mishnah. Tanan. The last part of our Mishnah was that Beis Hillel agree that if he had only had Erusin with the woman and not Nisuin, and we saw them check into the hotel, then there for sure we can assume that there was no intimacy because there was no familiarity between them before the fact. Now, if you're telling me that, Rabbi Yochanan, that our whole mission is talking about where we know for sure that they were physically intimate because there were witnesses peeping through the window, well then, what difference does it make if they had Erusin before and there was previous familiarity or not? We know for sure they were physically intimate. So it shouldn't make a difference whether the marriage previously was from Erusin or Nisuin. In both cases, according to Beis Hillel, she should require a get, because there was definitely physical intimacy. So our Mishnah doesn't make any sense the way you're reading it, Rabbi Yochanan. So Ella masnisin b'shalo ra'ua shenivala, v'Rabbi Yochanan da'amar ki haitana. So the Gemara says, you're right. Rabbi Yochanan is not interpreting our Mishnah. The only way to interpret our Mishnah is that there are witnesses that she had yichud with her ex-husband, but we don't know exactly what happened as far as their intimacy. Because that's the only way to understand the second part of the Mishnah, which distinguishes between Erusin and Nisuin. But Rabbi Yochanan knew that there was a brisa that disagrees with our Mishnah about the fundamental machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And he's subscribing to the brisa in opposition to the Mishnah. Let's see what the brisa says. The Tanya, Amar Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Lo nechluku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel al shelo ra'ua shenivala she'ena tzricha himenu get sheni. That Reb Shimon ben Elazar disagrees with our Mishnah. He says no. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai both agree that if there's no testimony that for actual intimacy, even Beis Hillel agree that there's no need for a get. Alma nechluku al sharua shenivala shebeis Shammai omrim adam osa bilaso bilaznus ubeis Hillel omrim ein adam osa bilaso bilaznus. That the only time that there's a machlokas is if where there were actual witnesses to the intimacy. Where Beis Shammai say just because there was intimacy doesn't mean there was remarriage, and Beis Hillel say no, intimacy equals remarriage because no one's going to just do it for promiscuous reasons. Umasnisin du kina below ra'ua shenivala b'may pligi. So now that we know that Reb Shimon ben Elazar argues with our Mishnah, and our Mishnah is where all we know is that they had yichud, but we don't know whether there was intimacy or not. So what's the machlokas according to that? According to our Mishnah, between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, Deika ede yichud v'leka ede bia. Beis Shammai savri lo amrinan heinen ede yichud v'heinen ede bia, or Beis Hillel savri amrinan heinen ede yichud v'heinen ede bia. That all we have are witnesses that they secluded themselves. Beis Shammai are of the opinion that we don't say just because they secluded themselves they were intimate, and Beis Hillel say no. Once you know that they secluded themselves, we assume that they were intimate. And therefore, according to the way we're understanding the Mishnah now, Beis Shammai says, I agree with Beis Hillel, that if we know that they had Bia, then we can assume it was for the sake of Kiddushin and she would need a second get. According to Beis, but we don't have any testimony for that, and therefore we don't have to make any assumptions. But Beis Hillel say no. Once we know they secluded themselves, then we can assume that they were intimate, and therefore she needs a get. Umodim b'niskar shemina erisin shenetzricha menu get sheni dekiven dein libo gaspa lo amrinan hein edebia. But here's where Beis Hillel agrees that she doesn't need a get. If the divorce was from erisin and not from nisuin, so there was no physical familiarity between the two of them before the fact, just because they secluded themselves in the same hotel means absolutely nothing in that scenario. There's only an assumption of physical intimacy when they already had familiarity physically with each other from before. But if that was not the case, then just because they secluded themselves does not indicate that they were physically intimate. So now the Gemara says, Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi. So basically what you're suggesting to me now is that Rabbi Bar Chana quotes his Rabbi Yochanan as saying that I hold like the Bryce's interpretation of the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and not like the Mishnah's understanding of the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. But that's problematic, because v'ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha kistam Mishnah v'ukimna l'masnisin b'shalo ra'ua shenivala. Because normally Rabbi Yochanan says all over throughout Shas that whenever we have a Mishnah that is anonymous, which means it doesn't say so-and-so says, but it just says, this is the halacha, Beis Shammai says this, Beis Hillel says this, we always paskin like the Stam Mishnah if there's a brisa that argues with it and quotes an authorship. So if there's a Mishnah that's Stam, that doesn't have any attribution, and we have the brisa which is Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Reb Yochanan would always paskin like the Mishnah. Now you're telling me that he goes like Reb Shimon ben Elazar of the brisa, and not like our Mishnah. He's saying that the machlokas is only when we have witnesses that she actually had intimacy, and according to our Mishnah is that there are no witnesses that there was intimacy. So how do you reconcile that? So the Gemara answers, Amaroi ninu v'aliba de Reb Yochanan. Very simply, Reb Yochanan had many talmidim. Some of his talmidim held that he always paskin like the Stam Mishnah. But other talmidim, like Rabbi Bar Chana, said, no, occasionally my Rebbe would hold like a brisa over a Mishnah, and therefore this is one of those cases where he paskins like the Reb Shimon ben Elazar's understanding of the machlokes in the brisa, and not like the Mishnah's understanding. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Kansa beget kereach teitze mizeh umizeh v'chol hadrachim ha'ilu ba. If a man divorces his wife with a bald get, then the bald get is invalid, and if she remarries based on that bald get, she has to leave her second husband, and we penalize her that she loses all financial benefits from both the first and second husband, as we had previously explained. Now, what is a bald get? So, in order to understand a get kereach, a bald get, we have to understand another concept called a get mekushar. What is a get mekushar? By the way, this is all according to Rashi. What is a get mekushar? A get mekushar is literally a sewed get, a get that you stitch up. Now, why do we write a get mekushar? This is not so prevalent in Maseches GITTEN. It's really written more in Maseches Bava Basra. When Kohanim would come to divorce their wives, we know, as Bob had pointed out a moment ago, that it's an irreversible process. A Kohen can never remarry his divorcee. So there was a practice, which we don't do anymore, but the practice was that when a Kohen came to divorce his wife, we would try to delay the process as much as possible and give him as hard of a time as we could, so that hopefully his temper will calm down and he'll realize he's making a mistake and he'll bring his wife home instead of divorcing her. So there are two things that we did. The first thing that we did is that we had the sofer write the first line in front of the Baal, in front of the husband, fold over the piece of paper, stitch it up, and have a witness sign on the back of the piece of paper that the first line, on the first line. Then the sofer writes the second line. We fold it over again, stitch it up, and have a witness sign on the back of the second line. And we do that continuously. Now, the second thing that we do is that we require a minimum of 3 witnesses to be actually the signatories on the piece of paper itself on the bottom of the get.
This is a delay tactic.
This is all a delay tactic. We
Only
require
for
only for Kohanim. Normally we require 2 witnesses to be signatories on the bottom of the get. Here we require 3. And we required 3 because it's just going to take a little bit longer to get that third guy. So those are the 2 things that we require that used to be done. That we don't do this anymore. We call the get mikushar. Now, what the Mishnah is saying is that if we do this get mikushar, and then we examine the get carefully and we discover that all of the lines on the back side of the parchment have witnesses signed on the back of it, except for one line, that get is invalid. The get's invalid. Right? So we'll discover why in just a moment. But that's what the Mishnah is talking about over here. And then the Mishnah says, Hakol mashlimin alav, well, it depends how many lines the get is. Hakol mashlimin alav divrei ben nanis, and Rabbi Akiva omer ein mashlimin alav ela krovin haruim lahoid b'makom acher. Now, the question is, what if you have that blank line and you want to make the get kosher before the husband gives it to his wife? So Ben Nanis says anyone can fill in that line as a witness, even if he's totally puzzled for edus, even if he's an Evet Kanani, even if he's a gambler or a ganaf, and he's puzzled edus, he could still sign it. Rabbi Akiva says, I agree that he doesn't have to be totally kosher for edus, but he can't be an Evet, he can't be a ganaf. He can be a relative though, and then he can sign it. So ve'ezu who get kereach kol shekasharav merubin me'edav. And what is the definition of a bald get? If the folds or the stitches outnumber the number of signatories on the back, meaning that you don't have every single stitched line signed on the back by an aid. So that's where we say that it's a bald get. So the Gemara now says, "My time of the get kereach gezera mishum kulachem." So firstly, the question is, just because one of the lines wasn't signed in the back, why does that invalidate the whole get? Everything else is kosher about it. So the Gemara answers, because we're concerned that when the husband was told we're going to do a get mekushar, so he was told, okay, let's get all the guys to sign the lines, and he gathers all his friends together to be signatories. Remember, we said that if a husband gives instructions and he says, kulchem chasomu, or kulchem ksovu, all of you, I want you to write the get. So then if even one person doesn't write it, it invalidates the get. It's like he put a tanai on the get, saying that if I only want it to be a kosher get if all of you sign. So if one of the lines is blank on the back, we have to suspect that maybe one of the guys that he required as a signatory did not sign, and it invalidates the entire get. Get kereach hakol mashlimin alav. So any person can be that signatory to fill in the bald spot, the blank line. So Rabbi Akiva eved my time alo the aslamim are kosher leedus. So the question is like this: Rabbi Akiva is a strange sheet that we don't understand. Ben Nanas, he says, listen, you're just filling in a blank line. It doesn't matter who signs it. It could be anybody. But Rabbi Akiva says, no, it can't be anybody. It can be a relative, even though he's pasal edus, but it can't just be any eved or any ganef. So what's the difference? We ask Rabbi Akiva. If he doesn't have to be kosher leedus, why can't you use an eved? Because why? People are going to think that he's going to be kosher for edus and they'll use him for some other document. Well, then karov nami asilamemer kosher leedus. Well, then why don't you have the same concern by a relative? If the relative signs the get, that's going to cause people to think that he's a non-relative, and they'll use him for some other document where that person is a party to. So ela eved hainu taima de dilma asula asuke liyuchsin. So maybe the reason why you can't use an eved is because if people see him accepted as a witness, they're going to think that he's a complete Yisrael, and they'll start making shidduchim with him for their daughters, and that's going to be terrible. But Gazlan de bar yuchsin hu liskasher. Alama Tanan Rabbi Akiva Omer Ein Mashlimin Alav Ela Krovim Haruyin Lohid B'Makom Acher Koravin Gazlan Lo. But according to that argument, then you should be allowed to use a Gazlan or some rogue, as long as he's 100% Jewish. But Rabbi Akiva's language is that you can only use a relative, but you can't use anyone else who's Pasal Edus, inclusive of a Gazlan who's 100% Jewish. Why should that be? So Ela Eved Hainu Taima Da Asul Memar Shichrurei Shachrorei Gazlan Nami Asul Memar Teshuva Avad. Karov ma'ikala meimar. Karov kuli almayadi to karovu. So the way I'm understanding this line is like this. The difference in Rabbi Akiva's eyes between an Eved and a Gazlan on the one hand and a relative on the other hand is that an Eved and a Gazlan always can have their status change. If people see the Eved signing, they're going to assume his status changed. He used to be an Eved, and the fact that he's now a signatory on the shtar is indicative of the fact that he was liberated, and now he's a free man, he's 100% Jewish. And that's not true. So people will use him in the future. People will ret shiduchim with him, people will use him as an aid, and he's still an Eved. The same thing with a Gazlan. If people see the Gazlan signing on the shtar, they're going to think, oh, he must have done tshuva, and the rabbis accepted his tshuva, so he's not a rogue anymore. But in reality, he still is just as much of a Gazlan as he was before, and people will use him in the future. People will go into business deals with him, and he'll fleece them blind, right? So that we don't want to see happen. But a relative is the only kind of person whose status can't change. And therefore, by using him in this instance, people will know, hey, isn't that Joe's brother-in-law? Well, if it's Joe's brother-in-law, then we can't use him ever again to be a witness for Joe. We know that he's a relative. So no one's going to make an assumption that his status changed like with the other two people, and that's why Rabbi Akiva makes this distinction in halacha. Amar Reb Zera, Amar Rabba bar Shiilta, Amar Rav Hamnuna Saba, Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava, Get kereach keshira shiva ve'edav shisha, shisha ve'edav chamisha, chamisha ve'edav arba'a, arba'a ve'edav shlosha. Ad kan machlokas benanis ve'Rabbi Akiva, aval kesharv shlosha ve'edav shnayim divrei hakol ein mashlimin alav ela karov. So the statement is made as follows. You know, at this point in the Gemara, there's no standard number of lines in a get. So if a get mikushar is 7 lines long, the definition of a bald get is if only 6 of those lines are signed on the back. And the same thing, if it's 6 lines long, a bald get would be if only 5 lines. And if it's 5 lines long, 4 lines. But once you get down to a 3-line get, everyone agrees that the person who's the signatory on the 3rd line is going to have to be a relative. Even Benanas would agree to that. So the question is why? And so we're going to see why in just a minute. So Amar lei Rabbi Zera l'Rabba bar Shiilta mechli kol shlosha b'mekushar kishnayim b'pasha dami mahasam karov lo afachanami karov lo. So he says, I don't understand. Perhaps your reasoning is because one of the things that we require by a get mekushar is that instead of 2 signatories on the bottom of the get, we need 3 signatories. So therefore your argument is, similarly, we need to have 3 signatories on the back that are kosher. But wait a minute. What does it mean kosher? If you need 3 signatories that are kosher on the bottom of the get, that's just like 2 witnesses on every other get. So they have to be completely kosher. They can't be relatives. So if that's the case, then if you've only got 3 lines, you should require that all 3 lines are signed by kosher Eidim and not relatives either. So even Rabbi Akiva and Benana should agree that not only can he not be pasul Eidus, but he can't be a relative either. So Amar lei afli didikashali ushi iltia l'Rav Hamnuna v'Rav Hamnuna l'Rav Ada bar Ahava v'Amar li hanach l'shlosha b'mekushar d'lavdi oraisa. So he said, I had this very same question. So I asked Rav Hamnuna, and Rav Hamnuna went and asked Rav Ada bar Ahava, and the response that came back was like this. The fact that you need a 3rd signatory on a get mekushar is only midrabanan. Really midoraisa 2 are kosher. And therefore, for the purposes of the signatures on the back of the lines of the get, it's okay to be liberal and only require that the 3rd signature is by someone who's merely a relative, as long as he's not totally pasul for Eidus. So Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brisa to support this. Get kereach kesharav shiva ve'edav shisha, shisha ve'edav chamisha, chamisha ve'edav arba'a, arba'a ve'edav shlosha, ad kan machlokas benanas v'Rabbi Akiva. But hishlam alav eved benanas omer havlad kosher v'Rabbi Akiva omer havlad mamzer. Aval kesharav shlosha ve'edav shnayim divrei akol ein mashliman alav ela karov. So the brisa seems to bear this out. The brisa says exactly what we've said, that a bald get is that if there's 7 lines of text, there's only 6 signatories on the back. If there's 6 lines of text, there's only 5 signatories. If there's 5 lines of text, there's only 4 signatories. But once you get down to a 3-line get, so then both Benanas and Rabbi Akiva agree that the 3rd signatory on the back has to be a relative, cannot be pasul eidus in any other more dramatic way, like being an eved or a gambler or a gazlan. Now it's interesting because That's what we say. In other words, only if it's more than a 3-line get do we say that according to Ben Nanas, if you get a guy who's pasal le'edus totally like he's an eved or he's a gazlan, that's where we'll say the get is still kosher, and if she remarries based on that get, the children that she has from the second marriage are kosher people because the get is kosher. But according to Rabbi Akiva, so much do we invalidate the get that the children that she has from the second marriage are going to be mamzerim.
So that's not the same edus of the get itself.
No, that's right. We have to be very careful to make that distinction. The guys signing on the back are not the 3 guys who are signing at the bottom of the get on the front of the get. Okay? They can be the same people, but they don't necessarily have to.
And are there there 3 each time, or just 1 each? 1 signature on the back?
1 signature per line from different people. Okay? So now, Rav Yosef Masni Kosher. Rav Yosef had a different version of the Bryce, and he said, no, if there's only 3 lines in the get, then the 3rd signatory on the back has to be totally kosher, can't even be a relative. Frek the Gemara Vahatanya Karov. But that's not what the Bryce says. Amarav Papa Tini kosher. He says that's taka the way Rav Yosef's version of the Bryce read. It read that he has to be totally kosher. Now we're going to finish with this. We'll try to run through it as quickly as possible. It really does go quickly. Amar Rabbi Yochanan lo huchsharu bo ela eid echad karov bilvad. Avol trelo dilma asi lekiyume bitrei krovim v'chad kosher. So Rabbi Yochanan says a very interesting halacha. We notice that the only thing that we do permit is that if you're short 1 signatory, then only one line that you're short can be filled in by someone who's a relative, according to Rabbi Akiva. But if, let's say, you have 2 lines blank, you can't get 2 relatives. We can only supplement with 1 puzzle person who's a relative. You can't do more than 1 aid who's puzzle. Why? We'll tell you why. Because let's say you have a 3-line get, and you want to be mekayim the get. Let's say the husband challenges the validity of the get. So what do you have to do if anyone challenges the validity of the get? You have to get 2 witnesses who either testify, we were there at the presentation of the get, we saw everything going according to halacha, or they can look at the signatures on the get and say, these signatures are legitimate signatures. Even though we weren't there, but we recognize the signatures. Now, in a situation, if you were to have 3 lines on the get, and the 3 signatories on the back, 2 of them were puzzle and 1 of them was kosher, you'd have a potential problem. Because let's say the 3 signatories in the front of the get are perfectly fine, but the 2 guys that you find in the shuk, who are going to be mekayim the get, who are going to substantiate the get, only recognize the signatures on the back, and don't recognize the signatures on the front. And that's okay. The basis is, listen, if you recognize the 3 signatures on the back, that's kosher. But wait a minute. There's 2 signatures out of those 3 that are krovim, that are not kosher edim. And if that's the case, then you've been mekayim the shtar illicitly. Because the kiyum of the shtar requires that the 2 witnesses that we get to testify recognize 2 kosher witnesses on the get. So therefore you see that you can't have more than 1 out of the 3 be a karov because of the purpose of kiyum shtaros. So Amar Rav Ashi Masnisa Namidika. Rav Ashi says that's inferred from the language of the Brisa also. To kamedalig v'tani chad chad shma mina. Because Rav Ashi says, look at the Brisa. It says that if you have a 7-line get, the definition of a bald get is if you only have 6 signatories. It doesn't say if you have a 7-line get, a bald get can be 5 signatories. It only goes from 7 to 6, from 6 to 5, from 5 to 4. So you see that the Bryce itself only allows for 1 line that's bald to be filled in by a non-kosher witness. So that in itself is inferred by the Bryce. Amar Abaye, Shma mina, hai karov chasim, iboy bein batchila bein be'emtza bein basof. Mimai, midalo kavalei makom. So Abaye says something very interesting. He says, look, the Mishnah and the Brisa never indicate to us, to tell us where that karov, where that relative is supposed to sign. So you see that there's no requirement that he has to be on the first line, on the last line, on the 3rd line. He can, whatever blank space there is, the relative can sign, and there's no further requirement. The very fact that the Brisa never makes that requirement is indicative of that. But then he says much further. He says, "Ushma mina mikol tlasim ekayminon velo ba'inon ritzufin Di'isal kedaitach ba'inin ritzufin likva le'makom lahai karov batchila o be'emtza o besof v'lichshur beituva. So Abaye says something else that's very, very clever. He says, I can also prove from this whole, the way that the halacha has been presented to us, that there's no structure in the way that we force the relative to sign. In other words, if there was a structure to the way that we force the relative to sign his line, then we could have arranged a halachic system whereby, if it's a very long-lined get, let's say the get is 7 or 10 lines long, right? So if we had a structure to the where the karov was supposed to sign the get, we could have arranged in such a way that you can only pick off the first 3 signatures, or the second 3 signatures, or the third 3 signatures, but they have to be contiguous signatures. And if we would have done it that way, and we would have created a structure whereby the karov always has to sign in between 2 kosher witnesses, then we could have guaranteed that if we're only going to be mekayim, only going to substantiate 3 signatures, we would always guarantee that 2 out of those 3 signatures are kosher edim. Because we would say that a person who's a karov can only sign after a kosher witness and before another kosher witness. And that way, you could have multiple krovim sign, if you have a multiple lined get. Just make sure that he inserts his John Hancock in between 2 kosher guys. And therefore we would pick off 3 contiguous signatures, and no matter what those 3 contiguous signatures were, it would be guaranteed that only 1 out of those 3 would ever be a puzzle, and there would be no problem of being Mekayim the Shtar, even if there's more than 1 karov signing on the get. But what does that indicate to us? The fact that we still insist that you can only have 1 karov signed on the get means that we don't require the 3 signatures that we substantiate to be contiguous. If, let's say, we have 11 lines, we can go and say, okay, you guys recognize signature number 1, signature number 4, and signature number 8. That's fine. You've been Mekayim the Shtar. And that's all you need for Kiyum Shor. You don't need to recognize 3 in a series. And the fact that we don't, the fact that that's all we require is they can do 1, 4, and 8, or 1, 3, and 7, or 2, 5, and 11, that proves to us, that's the reason why there's always the concern that 2 out of those 3 signatures will be of a karov if we allow more than 1 karov to sign. That's Abaye's proof. And finally, Ki asu l'kami de Rabbi Ami amar leitzei v'hashlim alav eved min ashuk. And finally, the last line of the Gemara is just to tell us how we paskin. There once was a case where there was a bald get, a get mekushar that was missing 1 line, and they needed 1 more signatory. So Rabbi Ami said, go find an Eved Kanani from the marketplace and have him sign. So what does that prove? How do we paskin? Like Ben Nanas, not like Rabbi Akiva, because according to Rabbi Akiva, he's got to be a relative. He can't be an Eved. But according to Ben Nanas, he can be an Eved. Hadron Allah Chazorek, have a wonderful day.